of English literature. So what I have been doing is not to bring in issues the way a conventional English literature class is run. I'm trying to doing something slightly different. What I have been trying to do is to create some kind of curiosity among scholars of English literature, how to look at English literary texts slightly from a different perspectives, especially when they are taught in a Muslim setting. So in the first few lectures, we talk about the need to look at English literature from Islamic perspectives. Then we discussed some authors. We discussed Rudyard Kipling, and then in the last class we discussed E.M. Forster. Today we are going to discuss Virginia Woolf, and we will look at her Professions for Women. This is an essay. We will look at it from an Islamic perspective. So I just want to recap what we did in the last few classes so that those who are not present, who couldn't participate, can have some idea what went on before. When we are discussing Rudyard Kipling, we found out that his writings have elements which can be interpreted as racist, imperialist. And then we discussed how we look at this kind of text from Islamic perspectives. Then we referred to some Quranic verses and hadiths where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam make self-evident statements regarding racism. And the two verses that I request all to remember when we discuss racism is verse 1 of Surah An-Nisa and verse 13 of Surah Hujurat. And then when we discuss colonialism, this is just a recap of what we did before. When we discuss colonialism, we need to bear in mind that all the colonizers in the past, they came with some excuses, some apologia. And they always portrayed colonialism as benevolent intervention. And in the words of Rudyard Kipling, the white man's burden. And this is how they have portrayed colonialism in history, in different periods in history. And there is a verse, there are two verses in the Quran which are directly related to this kind of colonialist apologia. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وإذا قيل لهم لا تفسدوا في الأرض قالوا إنما نحن مصلحون ألا إنهم هم المفسدون ولكن لا يشعرون. When it is said to them, do not create corruption on earth, they say, no, we are peacemakers. Then Allah says, no, they are the corruption makers, but they do not realize. So this is how we need to expose the colonialist apologia when they come with this kind of excuses like benevolent intervention or the white man's burden. And when we discuss colonialism and imperialism, we need to address some underlying charges against Islam and Muslim. Muslim rule in Spain and Muslim rule in South Asia are often regarded as colonial rule by a section of scholars. And we need to counter that argument that Muslims came to these regions purely for religious purposes to spread the message of Islam. They had no business interest. They settled down in these countries and they intermingled, they intermarried, and they did not take even a single penny from these areas to their countries of origin. And when we discuss E.M. Forster, we obviously found some fascinating pieces of information. For example, the character Cyril Fielding in A Passage to India is actually modeled upon Marmaduke Pickthall. Abdul Hakim Murad of Cambridge wrote a wonderful article to which Claire Chambers referred in her book, Britain Through Muslim Eyes, and they imply that the character Cyril Fielding was inspired by Marmaduke Pickthall. And in the text, A Passage to India, the main message that E.M. Forster conveys is only connect. He wants to connect beyond racial or religious boundaries. He wants to transcend religious boundaries when it comes to human relations. And in this kind of discussion, we must discuss Muslim, non-Muslim relations in the classroom. Otherwise, our students will be confused. They will not be able to relate their religious experiences with the text that they study. So when we talk about Muslim, non-Muslim relationships, we have two sets of Quranic verses, which are apparently contradictory, but actually, if we look at them carefully, they are not contradictory. For example, in verse 28 of Surah Al Imran and verse 139 of Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala apparently wants Muslim not to build bridges with non-Muslims. So actually in these two verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids us to establish moral alliance with non-Muslim. In other words, we should not follow their moral values or their religious practices. We should not prefer their lifestyle to our lifestyle. So this is kind of moral alliance. But in Surah Mumtahina verses 8 and 9, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there is no problem in establishing relationships with non-Muslims, and those kind of relationships are actually social or political alliance. So what I wanted to say in the previous class is that Islam forbids moral alliance with non-Muslims, but Islam does not forbid us to establish political or social alliance with them. And then we also discussed E.M. Forster's life, that he had huge respect for other cultural values and other religious traditions. So when we discuss E.M. Forster, there is a danger that some of us may promote religious syncretism. Religious syncretism means you take different religious practices from different religions and then you blend them. And you make a new religion on the basis of what you have taken from different religious traditions. So Islam encourages us to be tolerant, and Islam has no problem with coexistence with non-Muslims, but Islam does not support religious syncretism. And when we teach our students this kind of text, like A Passage to India, we need to learn ourselves first what is religious syncretism and how Islam does not allow religious syncretism, even though we have huge respect to a writer like E.M. Forster for his outreaching to other culture and religions. And we also discussed that when we talk about a text like A Passage to India, we must discuss the issue of Islam and humanism. Obviously, E.M. Forster, he gives supreme importance to human relationships and human connection, but there is also a danger that some people may drag it too far, and that they may promote the so-called humanism, which is actually a rejection of religion in favor of a belief in the advancement of humanity. So humanism, to some extent, is an atheistic philosophy. So we also need to be on guard that people cannot use a text like A Passage to India to promote humanism in Muslim societies. Now, we are now entering into a new discussion, a new author, that is Virginia Woolf. who is considered one of the greatest writers in English literature. Previously, Shakespeare used to hold huge importance in English literature, but now it seems that Shakespeare's days are over. Now it is Virginia Woolf who is considered the #1 literary figure in English literary tradition. In Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, she introduces a hypothetical character, Judith Shakespeare. And she says, if Shakespeare had a sister, and if her name, she gave a name, Judith Shakespeare, and if Judith Shakespeare had equal literary potential, equal merit, would it have been possible for Judith Shakespeare to be equally famous and equally productive as Shakespeare? So the conclusion she drew is that no, it would have not been possible for Judith Shakespeare to be equally productive or to be equally famous as Shakespeare did because of gender restrictions that a woman faced in the past. Now, scholars of English literature, they widely acknowledge that Judith Shakespeare is now Virginia Woolf. That Virginia Woolf has now become Shakespeare's sister, who has taken over the place that Shakespeare used to hold in English literature. For example, how do we determine the importance of a writer? We may actually look at the amount of research that is done on a particular author. And in today's literary practices, Virginia Woolf attracts more research than Shakespeare. There is an international organization called International Virginia Woolf Society, and they arrange an international conference annually, and that attracts almost thousands of presenters from all around the world, most especially from Britain and North America. And obviously there are many PhD theses and many books have been written on Virginia Woolf. And when we discuss Virginia Woolf, we must bear in mind that she is now a kind of feminist icon in the Western world. Many people regard her as their feminist role model, and this is because of her importance as a writer mainly. And as we discussed earlier, that no writer or no literary text can be 100% Islamic or 100% un-Islamic or non-Islamic. So when we study Virginia Woolf, some of the ideas we may find compatible with Islamic teachings, and some other ideas may not be compatible with Islamic teachings. So I have chosen a text. It's a very short text. It's an essay, Professions for Women. And we will see like she promotes some ideas which go against core Islamic values. But there are also some other ideas which we can accept and which make sense and which are we have no problem to accept within our Islamic periphery. Now, I want to say a few words why this issue, and Virginia Woolf is mainly known as a feminist writer, why this feminist issue or the question of gender is important for us Muslims in today's world. We must understand that the Islamophobes, people who hate Islam, they generally do not say openly that they hate Islam. They focus on some issues and they make use of them to misrepresent and distort the message of Islam. For example, there is a contemporary writer in Britain. His name is Martin Amis. Some of you may have heard his name. And he is known as a critic of Islam. He made many statements which are outright Islamophobic. In one of his interviews, I think, he said, I don't think that we can accommodate cultures and ideologies that make life very difficult for half of the human race. I paste this quote in the chat box so that you can have a look at it. So this is what he said. He said that I don't think that we can accommodate cultures and ideologies that make life very difficult for half of the human race. Actually, he refers to Islam, but he does not say so. So he believes that Islam is against half of the human race, that is women. So this is how the gender issue or the question of feminism is used to undermine Muslims or to misrepresent the message of Islam. And we all know that Virginia Woolf came from a very high-profile family. Her father, Sir Leslie Stephen, was a Victorian colossus. He was highly respected as a writer, and he was the editor of a National Dictionary, and which was a very popular book during his time. And the kind of household where Virginia Woolf was brought up was visited by some high-profile Victorian writers. And this is how the house was full of literary discussion. And I give you a list of writers, Victorian writers, who used to visit the Stephen family, I mean the family of Virginia Woolf and her parents, like William Makepeace Thackeray, Henry James, George Henry Lewis, George Eliot, Lord Tennyson. All of them were regular visitors to Virginia Woolf's family, to the Stephen family. And this is how the family had a very literary environment. And the Stephen children, they used to produce a magazine even when they were children in the late 1890s. And I think we don't have time to discuss much of her biography, which most of us know. That obviously we know one fact for sure, that she is one of those feminist writers who committed suicide. And she actually made attempts to commit suicide several times. And then once, and the last time in 1941, she became successful. And we have few other feminist authors who actually committed suicide. And I give you a list in the chat box, like the American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Sylvia Plath, and Virginia Woolf, and Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter. They all committed suicide, and they are all known as feminist scholars in the Western world. Now, the essay that we are going to discuss is called The Professions for Women. This was actually a speech that Virginia Woolf gave to National Society for Women's Service. That is an organization that actually fought for women's right to vote. We know that the suffrage movement was very strong in the early 20th century, and they made huge changes in British society. Women first got the right to vote in 1918, women 30 and above, and then in 1928, universal suffrage, women over 20 and above 21 and above got the right to vote. So this society was hugely influential, and Virginia Woolf was invited to give a talk in front of the National Society for Women's Service. This is actually a new name of the original organization that fought for women's right to vote. And eventually this speech was published in her book, The Death of the Moth and Other Essays, in 1942 after her death. Now, the main argument of this essay is that when a woman wants to write something, she faces two main obstacles. And Virginia Woolf was giving her own personal experiences, how she faced these two obstacles and how she overcame them. Number one obstacle was that she says when I wanted to write a review of a book written by a man, she was haunted. She was haunted or she was approached by a phantom, and the phantom is the angel in the house. She actually refers to a poem written by a Victorian writer, and where the writer he actually glorifies the Victorian notion of womanhood. This is the poem, The Angel in the House. The author is, how can I forget it? The author of The Angel in the House is, let me find in a minute, it just escapes my memory. Coventry Petmore. Coventry Petmore, he is a Victorian writer. He wrote this poem, The Angel in the House, and he celebrates some virtues of women that was highly regarded in the Victorian period. Now, I want to take you to a different discussion for a while, because we need to get grips of some other issues if we want to understand this text. In feminist literature, we have three phases. I shared with you these three phases in the chat box: the feminine phase, the feminist phase, and the female phase. From 1840 to 1880, that was the feminine phase. Then from 1880 to 1920, that is the feminist phase. And then 1920 onwards is the female phase. And this division is actually, it came from one feminist scholar. Her name is Elaine Shawalter, and she wrote a very famous book, Literature of Their Own. If some of you are interested in this book, I write it down. Literature of Their Own. It was published in 1977. So Elaine Shawalter is, she came up with these three phases: feminine, feminist, and female. So in the feminine phase, women actually, they wanted their rights, like Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Austen and all other writers. They wanted their women's rights, but they accepted the conventional notion of femininity. This is the feminine phase. The next one is the feminist phase, is the phase of protest. Women started to protest. Then the last phase is female phase. That is a kind of, some people may regard it as extreme, in the sense that they do not want to look at women with reference to gender. They want to define women without any reference to gender. So Virginia Woolf is the most prominent writer of the female phase. So that's why in her writing there are some ideas which may be considered extreme by many people, in the sense that she does not want to look at women with reference to gender. She just wants to look at women as female or another gender, and she does not, that does not have to be with reference to men or with reference to any gender. So Coventry Petmore, he devoted this poem, and The Angel in the House, to his wife, and he was eulogizing, highly praising his wife, because his wife was very devoted. His wife was very pure. His wife was very obedient. So all sorts of qualities he found in his wife, which he highly appreciated. So Virginia Woolf says that when I was writing reviews of books written by men, I was attacked by this phantom of the angel in the house, because women in the Victorian period was portrayed as the angel in the house, as if she is very harmless, she is very cooperative, she is very obedient, she is very devoted, very loyal to her husband, and she is always in the service of her husband. And at that time when Coventry Patmore wrote the poem, it was very famous. And it was a kind of household object in every family. So that was very popular. But later, that poem became a subject to denigration and criticism, because obviously many people, especially the families, they do not regard women only as loyal or subservient to men. So Virginia Woolf says that when I was writing reviews of books written by men, then I was attacked by this idea of femininity, that women cannot be critical of books written by men. So this was number one obstacle. And then she says that when I was writing reviews, actually she used to work for Times Literary Supplement. She used to write reviews for Times Literary Supplement. She did it for, I think, for 3-4 decades. And she said, I needed money. And if I write reviews, I don't get much money, but I wanted more money. So I started writing novels. And then she says, when I was writing novels, I faced another problem. What was the other problem? The other problem is that it is okay for men to talk about sexuality, but if a woman discusses sexuality, then she invites hostility from men. So this is her second issue in the essay, that as a woman, I am not allowed to talk about bodily experiences, sexual experiences. So in that sense, she is actually promoting free speech, that a woman can say whatever she wants. Now, if we want to understand professions for women, these two issues that Virginia Woolf raises, number one is the angel in the house. The number two is the sexual double standard that was very prevalent in Victorian society and beyond. We need to understand how women were portrayed in Victorian society. And in today's discussion, we may not be able to do all of this, but I suggest, if you have time, you read one of my articles where I discuss this issue extensively, how women were portrayed or how women were regarded in Victorian society, and in particular, but in Western cultural tradition in general. At the beginning of this chat box, I mentioned 10 of my articles. And I have other articles on women gender issues, but I mentioned 10 of my articles. So those who are interested for further studies, you can have a look at those 10 articles or some of them. But to understand Virginia Woolf and to understand professions for women, I suggest, if you have time, please, you have a look at this article, Women in the Western Cultural Tradition and the Caricature of Islam as Misogynistic. There I discuss how women were perceived and portrayed in pre-modern Britain, and in particular, and in Europe in general. So what happened is that during the Victorian period, there are writers like, in Europe, there are writers like Rousseau and John Gregory, James Fordyce, and they used to regard women very negatively. They even argued whether women had soul or not, and they even argued they were opposed to any kind of education for women. So this is the kind of background that we need to know if before we understand Virginia Woolf completely. Now, when Virginia Woolf was promoting her ideas, she obviously, as I said, some of her ideas are acceptable. We can accept. I can accept. For example, when she says that women cannot criticize men, a woman cannot write reviews of a man, of a book written by men. This is unacceptable because there is no restriction on women in Islam that disallow them to criticize or to get engaged in intellectual discussion. And we can also accept when she says that there is a sexual double standard in literary production, in the sense that men can talk about sexual experiences in their writing, but when a woman does so, she is subjected to criticism. So these we have no problem with. But some of the issues that Virginia Woolf highlights and promotes in this essay are highly un-Islamic. And if we do not tell our students that these ideas are un-Islamic, and actually these ideas can be harmful for women themselves, we need to if we do not tell our students, then we will do a disservice to them, and they may be misguided or misled by this kind of writing. For example, one of her complaints is that the Victorian woman was pure. That she said that the Victorian woman, I quote her, she was pure. So this is a complaint Virginia Woolf makes against Victorian women, as if sexual purity or to remain faithful to husband is a problem. And in Islam, we cannot accept this kind of idea. We cannot accept this kind of idea where it says that women cannot remain pure, that in order for them to enjoy liberation or freedom, they need to be impure, they need to establish multiple sexual relationships with multiple men. Or in today's world, that also happens between the same gender. So this we cannot accept. And this goes against the core value of Islam, of our religion. So when we discuss professions for women, when we come across this kind of ideas that Virginia Woolf is against women's purity, then this is a problem. And it's not only women's purity. We need to promote the purity of both men and women. And there is a kind of sexual double standard even among Muslim or even in Muslim societies. For example, in society, when we see that a woman commits a sin, she is doubly or triply penalized compared to a man. So this we must understand, and this we must accept, and this is equally unacceptable. A sin is a sin for both men and women. A sin is not a lesser sin because the perpetrator is a man, and a sin is not a greater sin because the perpetrator is a woman. These kind of ideas are not supported by Islam. But this is what we say, what we believe. Other people may not accept it, but this is what our religion says. Now, I want to look at this argument that Virginia Woolf promotes from a different perspective. I quote Doris Lessing in the chat box. If you can just have a look, please. Doris Lessing says, for untold centuries, women have endured bad marriages and male infidelity. Never forget that the suffrage slogan was votes for women and chastity for men. So this is a very important statement. And I find Doris Lessing much more reasonable and much more closer to Islam than Virginia Woolf. What Doris Lessing says in this quote is that For centuries, women have been suffering because of men's infidelity. Men have been unfaithful to their wives for a very long time. So women have been suffering from this problem. The solution is not that women will also start the same problem, or women will also start establishing multiple relationships. And in that regard, Doris Lessing refers to the suffrage movement, when the slogan was votes for women and chastity for men. That means we must establish women's political right, women's right to participation in the political process. At the same time, we must make sure that men remains chaste, men remain pure, men remain faithful to their wife. So this is a good solution, that we need to make sure that both men and women remain faithful in their marital relationships. But what Virginia Woolf proposes is like proliferating or increasing the problem. Previously, man was unfaithful, especially let's say in Victorian society and beyond, and women were largely faithful. Now, Virginia Woolf wants women also to be unfaithful. And I don't think that this is the right solution. So when we teach professions for women to our students, we must make it very clear that what Virginia Woolf says goes against the teachings of Islam. And practically speaking, when both men and women become unfaithful, the real sufferers are children in the family. The real sufferers are the children in the family. Eventually, family is broken, and the life of the family members become horrible. And this we know. So the solution Virginia Woolf proposes is not a solution for men or women. This is harmful for family life. Now, the second argument that Virginia Woolf promotes is this. She says that, I quote what she says in the essay. She says that this is the right of a woman to talk about sexuality in her books, in her, let's say, in her novels. This is what she says: telling the truth about my own experiences as a body. That means for women to discuss their sexual experiences, what we regard as pornographic literature. So she says that this is the right of women writers to talk about their sexual experiences. Now this takes us to a bigger debate, to another debate. Among the feminists, we have two groups of scholars, or two groups of feminists. These are the two main groups in this regard. We call them, I shared that with you in the chat box, anti-pornography feminist and anti-censorship feminist. Anti-pornography feminist and anti-censorship feminist. So Virginia Woolf presents herself in this essay as an anti-censorship feminist. She believes that there should not be any restriction on any writer, is here in this case on female writers, on discussing their bodily experiences, discussing their sexual experiences. Conversely, we have another group of feminists who believe that when pornographic materials, sexually explicit materials are widespread in society, the ultimate victims are women themselves. These are anti-pornography feminists. For example, let me share with you a quote by an anti-pornography feminist. Her name is Robin Morgan. She is an American feminist. This is what she says. in one of her famous writings. She says, pornography is the theory and rape is the practice. That means when pornographic materials proliferate in society, when pornographic materials spread in society, the eventual victims are women. Many men, irresponsible men, will be provoked and they will sexually harass many women. So eventually the victims are actually women themselves. And interestingly, Virginia Woolf not only talks about pornographic materials and promotes this kind of writing where there is no censorship, there is no restriction on sexual expression. Personally, Virginia Woolf also practiced that kind of lifestyle. I attended Virginia Woolf conference first in 2004 in Bloomsbury in London, and then in 2006 in Birmingham. In Birmingham, there was one presentation on Virginia Woolf by a feminist scholar named Maggie Hams. She presented in front of us naked images of Virginia Woolf. This is how Virginia Woolf presented herself. And let me share, and then later, Maggie Hams actually produced a book, and the book is published, and I am sharing with you the cover of the book. Let me see if it works or not. This is the cover of the book, and you will see images of Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell. Okay, this is the image. So this is, you see the image in the at the bottom, the Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell. They posed in front of a photographer and they are completely naked. So when we teach this kind of writer, and if we do not look at them from Islamic perspective, then we may end up giving our students a wrong message, which we cannot afford, especially in a Muslim setting or at a university in a Muslim country. Now, when we discuss this kind of issues like anti-censorship feminists, obviously the question of freedom of expression comes in our discussion, and we cannot avoid it. And the freedom of expression is a huge topic in literature, in other disciplines of the humanities and social sciences. So I just want to spend a few minutes on the question of freedom of expression. And we generally refer to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, when we talk about freedom of expression. And we also refer to International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So I just want to share with you the Article 19 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what it says. It says, this is Article 19 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So this is some kind of free license to share any kind of information through any means. But we also need to bear in mind, in the same article of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we have another article, and that is, I share with you in the chat box, that says that Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally or in writing or in print, or in the form of art or through any other means of his choice. This is what the Article 19 says. But there is a phrase in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that says, I share with you that one as well, that will give us some different perspective. And that says there must be some reasonable restriction accommodated by ICCPR in order to respect the rights of others and in the name of public safety, law and order, public health and morality. So these particular aspects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is often ignored. People do not want to talk about it. It has some restriction that is designed to promote public safety, law and order, public health and morality. So this is something that we need to bear in mind when we talk about freedom of expression. And we have some British proponents of freedom of expression, and they say almost the same thing, that freedom of expression is not absolute. Freedom of expression is not without restriction. For example, John Stuart Mill, he defines liberty as the right of the individual to think and act as they wish, providing that they harm no one else by doing so. So when we spread, proliferate, disseminate pornographic literature, pornographic material, that harms many people. That harms public morality. That harms our sense of decency. And John Milton, he is considered one of the greatest proponents of freedom of expression. He says that the government must have a vigilant eye how books demean themselves as well as men, and thereafter to confine, imprison, and do sharpest justice on them as malefactors. So John Milton also has this sense of restriction with regard to freedom of expression. Now, I want to conclude with two examples. I think this discussion of freedom of expression is very pertinent in feminism and also in other areas. We have the Egyptian Nobel laureate Naguib Mahfouz. Once he was asked by someone about freedom of expression. And this is what he said. He said that you have the right to stretch your arm. You would have the right to stretch your arm, but when you stretch your arm, you must see whether you have someone next to you. If someone is standing next to you, you cannot stretch your arm because you will be punching that person if you stretch your arm when there is someone next to you. And in one of my writings, I wrote an article titled, Do Muslims Have Equal Right to Free Speech? In that article, I mentioned another example, like when we drive, if there is a traffic light, we stop. But when the traffic light goes green, we are allowed to drive, provided there are no cars in front of us. If the light is green, legally I can drive, but we do not drive if there is a car ahead of me. If that car does not move, then we do not drive, because if I drive when there is a car ahead of me or there is a person ahead of me, I will end up in an accident. So this is how I look at freedom of expression. The freedom of expression is there, but we also need to look at public morality and the safety of human character. So I believe this is a very long discussion, and in one discussion we cannot do justice to the ideas of Virginia Woolf or to the idea, these two ideas these two issues that we have tried to cover. Now, if you have some questions, I'll be very happy to entertain. But I request you to have a look at the list of articles that I have shared with you. There are many other things that I could not share with you here. These are there in those of my articles. With this, I conclude. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Very interesting and heavy discussion. So we got some response from our brothers sisters. You can write in the chat and ask.
Brother Sharon?
Yes. Anyone to ask question? Okay, we get from our brother Nuruddin. I want to ask your opinion about the concept of gendered Islamophobia developed by Jasmine Zain. According to Zain, at this time...
Actually, I have an article that I mentioned, Feminism as Islamophobia. And I have another article titled The Orientalization of Gender. And in these two articles, I have discussed this gendered Islamophobia, how the feminist issue, how the issue of gender is used to spread Islamophobia. So gendered Islamophobia is a very important discussion that we must get involved in because as I said at the beginning of my discussion, that gender issue, women's issue, feminist issue are used to misrepresent and to malign the image of Islam. So yes, we need to be aware of gendered Islamophobia, how gender issue is used to misrepresent the message of Islam.
Any more questions?
All these someone said, please provide the article links. Most of these articles are available online. If you just do a simple Google search, you will get it. Some of them are not available because of copyright restriction. If you kindly send me an email, then I can share with you through email those articles which are not publicly accessible in the internet.
But for the sake of asking, how about the one who against Virginia Woolf? Any authors or writers or confronting?
No, obviously, like Doris Lessing is fiercely against this kind of sexual liberation or this kind of open sexuality. And actually, in 2001, Doris Lessing gave a speech at Edinburgh Book Festival, and that created a huge row. And she was calling the feminists some of the nastiest women. She uses the term the nastiest to describe a section of feminists who promote open sexuality in the name of feminism. And obviously, I mentioned Robin Morgan, the American feminist, who said pornography is the theory and rape is the practice. So these kind of writers are there, and we should bear in mind that feminism is not monolithic. It's not only Virginia Woolf. There are other writers who do not support this kind of open sexuality or sexual liberation. So the good reference would be Doris Lessing, and I have high regard for Doris Lessing as a feminist writer. And if you are interested, I have an article on Doris Lessing, discovering Doris Lessing, and in my book I also included that article as a chapter. The book that many of you may have, Islamic Perspectives on 20th Century English Literature. So the best way, I think it will be better if brothers and sisters can send me email for any articles. I write my email address in the chat box. So this is my email address. For articles that you may not be able to obtain, you can write to me. I will inshallah email those to you.
Okay, Prof. Final words for tonight. A solid 1 hour. Okay, bro, we can conclude for tonight. Any final words?
Okay, so I think there is an interesting question. If we may not have time, but I just want to say a few words. This is a very important question. Is there a difference in the understanding of feminism in the Islamic perspective and the Western perspective? We need to understand that today's West is also not monolithic. We cannot say this is Western, this is Eastern. West is everywhere and East is also everywhere. There are many Eastern values there in the West. There are also many Western values there in the West. So what we are fighting against as Muslims and as reasonable human beings are actually the evil forces that are everywhere, not only in the East, not only in the West. So obviously, if you say Western perspective, this is a human perspective, and human perspective cannot be 100% good or cannot be 100% bad. And this we discussed towards the beginning of this course. So there will be obviously some differences between so-called Western perspectives and Islamic perspectives, but this is not because of any geographical association or because of the geographical location of Western countries. No, this can be also the case with many Eastern societies or many Eastern perspectives. Islam is not Eastern or Western. Islam is universal. When we talk about Islam and a particular society, we need to look at them holistically, not because of their geographical association.
We have one last question from Brother Nuruddin.
I think stream of consciousness technique is a totally different topic, and if I could discuss her to the lighthouse, that or Mrs. Dalloway, that would be a very good topic for discussion. But in today's discussion, we do not have time to cover the stream of consciousness technique.
Next time.